Hello everyone, today a brief reference to the Mudéjar troops, the Mudéjar militias if you prefer. These forces that were fundamentally levied from the properly the Mudéjar communities. This gave the name to the wall, it was properly a status, right? In Catalan it's also known as Mudéjar as far as I know. It's a Spanish term derived from the Arab word mudayya that means belated, right? Fundamentally, those who had remained behind meant properly the Muslims that had remained in their settlements after the Christian conquest. So fundamentally, that had been left behind by their co-religionaries in the Reconquista context. And also, the meaning has expanded to define properly those, in fact, Muslim communities that had received thus the status, the right to remain as tributaries in Christian territories. And there is a long story, as long as the Reconquista. By the way, the Mudéjar, as an Arab term, is referred also properly from Arab sources to many other contexts that are of frontier that we find up to very late in time. This existed with the Byzantine frontier in Asia Minor, even the broader Ottoman frontiers up to the 18th and the 19th century. So it's not specific of the Reconquista. But today, fundamentally, we look at properly the trooper as such of a Mudéjar trooper. Which is witnessed also in art, and Mudéjar is a term better known, I would say, for the specific architectural, artistic style that remain, in fact, evidently Islamic influenced in the Iberian Peninsula, because these communities also remained for a long time. Sometimes, that after 1492 there was a switch, there was a change. The term was after the decree, especially of Granada of 1502, there was a forced conversion of all the enormous, but really enormous, Muslim and Jewish populations that were in Spain. We will see the proportion was really relevant. As Muslims were consequently called Moriscos. In certain areas in Valencia, if I'm not wrong, they remained up to even the early 17th century, but they were an integral part of Iberian communities, and they mostly kept working with their styles, with their administration, because the Mudéjar status came together with properly these concessions that varied in nature over the centuries made by the Christian conquerors to the Muslim communities, because this term, actually, as far as I know, is not witnessed in often at all. It's like it may be present as Mudéjar. There were other terms that were properly, that described what was the whole condition of these people. That may date just once to the 70s of the 15th century, so also pretty late in time. But the practice was different. Today we talk mostly about the late Middle Ages to define properly certain troopers that appear in sources of that time, in mostly Christian art, illuminations mostly, from manuscripts. But the story began much earlier, as especially these conditions were started being negotiated, as you understand, more often and more formally for us also to track historically, between, let's say, the 11th to 12th century, right, when the Christians began to turn the tide of the properly power struggle with the Muslims during the Reconquista, and were of course anxious of receiving the support of Muslim communities, as it's widely known. I mean, mostly the initial, the Castilian, the Leonese power that initially expanded in the central plateaus, etc., were seeking an imperial, fundamentally they were pursuing an imperial policy of protectors of Christians, Muslims, and Jews altogether. And the initial regulations here for the maintenance of an autonomy of the non-Christian communities were much more generous, right? They started properly as the grant of every kind of essentially of local political administrative traditions, of course religious freedom. They actually paid less taxes under the Christian control than there was in Muslim times, right? The taxes were substituted with tithes. Eventually things changed because, first of all, these centers also saw an important Christian immigration. These Muslim communities were, doesn't matter how large they were, but they properly also were increasingly more detached as the Reconquista progressed from properly Islamic influences and contacts, right? And this brought even to a certain specific type of language, was, essentially just Castilian in these areas, but written with the Arab alphabet, right? But there were still some important intersections and reciprocal influences, infiltrations, etc. There was an effort also from the Muslim side with the fatwas to basically ask the coreligionaries in Christian lands to emigrate, right? Some rights of the Mudéjars by Christian concession was also the one of moving essentially at will, freedom. And however, over time, these communities were always more squeezed. Many of these people also were, interested in converting. Before the forced ones, conversions at the end of the Middle Ages, sexual relations between Muslims and Christians were legal, right, in Christian societies. There was all, there is all a very complex and very large, actually, chapter of Iberian history dealing with this specific aspect that naturally was aimed at winning the support of these communities. That, as we've seen, as consistent as they were, as the important they resulted in the broader struggle. And there were also, that Muslims had in this regard also some important roles. For example, in Valencia, there were the so-called moros paliers, as far as I can pronounce, that were considered as the king's protectors, right? Others were also different levels of protection, right? They were the decimates and the quitates that, for example, had lesser degrees. In the Balearic Islands, there was kind of basically total slavery, right? In other times, they were just, feudal subjects. Fundamentally. And the status of Mudéjar fundamentally was extended also to the entire community. Like at some point also this Nasrid Emirate of Granada, after the fall for 8 years, was fundamentally had acquired a Mudéjar status as such, right? So there is all a different scale properly, and it depends on the local story fundamentally. But just to give you an idea of the demographic incidence of the Mudéjars. Well, in the 14th century, 30% of the Aragonese population and the vast majority of Valencians was Mudéjar, right? By the end of the Middle Ages, they represented still 11% of the population of the Crown of Aragon. Right. So gradually, these communities became to be ever more oppressed, marginalized, and together with it was ever greater the demand for military contribution. That since the beginning, for political reasons, as we've seen, balance of power internal to these societies were also willing to participate. Again, the thing is very shaded. It depends where we're talking about. So today, we don't even talk about their organization. That was, however, rather simple. Say they were initially these people had even been exempted from military service. Eventually, especially in Aragon, they became to be ever more squeezed, as we've seen. so much that it would be used actually against as garrison troops and essentially armaments suppliers for frontier fortresses against Castile specifically. And their condition at some point was, such for which they could perform duties which Christian fief-holders and freemen would not do, right? And their pay, their contribution was ever greater and very poorly rewarded on the long run, right? Together with Muslims, also Jews were conscripted into royal armies. We get that they were mostly infantry, right? Because they lived still in societies where, the development of an elite was becoming ever more difficult. Specifically, they surely, there was specific cavalry, right? But these were fundamentally militiamen altogether. So we probably there was something like at some point some knight, some heavier trooper, right? This was just not the norm, especially in the traditional division, being half archers and half spearmen, so lighter troopers, that there is this broader idea that in Muslim warfare there was a greater amount of missile troops compared to Western forces. It's like, I don't know, the Sicilian Saracens of Frederick II's bodyguard, or like in this case, the lighter troopers in general. The Iberian Peninsula altogether had this, by this historical influence, also predated Islamic conquest. Important, skirmish troopers, missile troopers, the jinetes in general, the light cavalry, specialized in hit and run tactics. So we don't have to think even of a great difference in nature, right? Between these troops, even between Christians and Muslims. And levies were mostly drawn from towns, right? That were as I understand, the most that had the most productive communities, and were most of also sometimes the expulsions took place when the Mudéjar presence was considered intolerable, whereas in the countryside there was more tolerance, because at the end of the day these were ever less, let's say nobody cared really, because they were less influential communities. They would just be labor force under some lord, and gradually, as we were saying before, they would gradually Christianize, and so on. And such local communities of Muslims and Jews were called al-yamas, which comes from the Arabic yaman. It means gather, right? So it means congregation, assembly, group, community, basically like guilds, like corporations, as also most of the rest of the Christian society was fundamentally organized at the time. There was naturally the amount of troops varied. We know from 10 or 20 or 30 men to 80 or 100, 150, or even 200, right? And some fought in distinct units under their own chiefs. Others were actually indiscriminately intermixed with other troops as well, which by this later time in history is also fascinating, because that there is an increasing tactical specialization even in the Lanxes, in the this fundamentally tactical nuclei that fought, like they had a knight, then a lighter horseman, then some troops on foot, and normally when they were arrayed for battle they were drawn all separately, like all the knights of the various nuclei together, and the infantry from another side. So this probably, in the broader organization, also properly, this Mudéjar's troops didn't have much of a individual numerical consistency. They weren't enormous bodies of troops, right? If you're talking about 200, yeah, maybe you may wanna keep them also for reasons of internal cohesion together. But we're talking about in the range of the tens, right? You can also keep them together, but they're not going to be treated as an entire unit on its own, right? We understand that Muslim troops supplied more often cavalry than the Jews did. In an instance of 1358, a town was assessed for 65 cavalry. Well, this was equally divided between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, which is a pretty neat segmentation of many Iberian communities of the time from a religious and ethnic point of view. It was agreed that cavalry service of the non-Christian elements could be commuted to 146 foot soldiers, that is roughly 3.5 infantry per horseman, which is also a nice indicator there of the tactical ratio. We know that the Mudéjars summoned from Murcia to fight for Castilla at the Battle of Aljubarrota included cavalry as well. So we understand definitely that Muslim troops especially were more kind of mounted by traditional style, what had been historic also this great frontier of middle Spain fundamentally that had remained about mostly raiding warfare, where light cavalry and these tactics that traditionally the Moors were famous for would be maintained. If anything, for a matter of lifestyle, because certain lands were literally no man's lands, and they literally did even the social landscape changed. For example, the great transhumance, the great ship breeding capacities even of Spain's grew, because those lands could have been put to agriculture, but war for centuries had left these huge spaces sometimes properly unprofitable for long-term investment because of the political instability of military activity that took place in there. So this kind of warfare was maintained. I have no specific information about, a certain type of, for example, bows made maybe in a more Islamic style. Then this could be found properly also, in Christian armies. That, however, at this point by the 14th century, 15th, were growing ever more Western in nature, right, in Spain. Much heavier, much more feudal properly, and with the dominating role of Castile as well. And this actually seems to be reflected, the tactical segmentation, even in the properly in the equipment of the Mudéjar, because it seems that in Aragon, Mudéjars were mostly infantry, right? Whereas in Castilla, cavalry existed too. Of course, there is nothing, say, organistically or categorical about that. But Aragon was traditionally more famous for its infantry compared to Castilla. It was, Aragon had kind of stronger middle classes, stronger urban communities. They would mostly go with militias of kind of middle class troops. In practice, also these mountaineers, the famous Catalan, the Almogavars, etc. Whereas in the feudal plains of Castilla, Mudéjars themselves made more use of cavalry in general, right? So there is nothing strange. This is mirrored properly in the Castilian and Aragonese military, tactical tendencies as well. So it's the perfect exact thing. Do we have any representation specifically of Mudéjars? Well, we actually do. There are beautiful pictures that properly show this kind of mix. The fact that you would have properly Muslim troops throughout all the Reconquista, but the Near Eastern Crusades, the whatever, fighting in Christian armies, right, and vice versa as well. So and also properly fighting in their traditional style, to be depicted also in a way that, according to the artist that was representing them, with a specific, traditional, at least as it was perceived. It might have been a license, right? Probably but let's say Muslim, say Arab kind of fighting style, equipment, armament, etc. Whereas it's probable that actual equipment was much, especially of these lighter troops, also in the Castilian and Aragonese army, would be almost indistinguishable, right? There is an interesting scene in an early 15th century edition of Cuvelier, Life of du Guesclin, that depicts the Battle of Nayera, and there are 8 Muslim soldiers in the original, of which 3 are clearly armed with lances or javelins, 1 with a sword, and 1 a pole axe. While 2 of the remaining 3 are a trumpeter and a standard bearer. So there you get a neat segmentation that could be easily also of a Christian army there. Lances, javelins, sword, pole axes. Right, there is nothing even specifically, ethnic about this. Some have round shields in their presentations, others heather types. These Mudéjar troops were still summoned in Castile as late as the Aljubarrota campaign in 1385. Each district had to provide a fixed quota of men, and it was part fundamentally of the broader, levy of the kingdom. As we were saying before, the Aragonese Mudéjars seemingly were more infantry and divided half and half into archers and spearmen, right? Albeit it seems that the former role was more common, or at least there are more references to it. Even in here, whether it was a specific bias because of Islamic military influence, or because archers were actually cheaper than the spearmen, so maybe it reflected a worsening of their social conditions. I don't know. Sure is that also Aragon was, important. We don't even know specifically whether they were equipped with bow or crossbow. In fact, there is a document of 1361 that properly records the equipment of such archers, literally meant to be a bow, but it might have been probably a crossbow. It's even more likely at that point, also because of the general having of the battlefields, protection, the defensive equipment, etc. May be too mechanistic of an explanation, but this included also 100 arrows or passadors in the original language that may have been properly in fact crossbow bolts. While spearmen were issued a quote sturdy shield, a lance and 2 javelins or a sword, and possibly a helmet. So this is a kind of a medium infantry, if we want. Not even so poorly equipped, actually, but still light and constituting surely not the concrete backbone of the army. Would still be, cavalry fundamentally, and also some kind of heavier infantry, but still in these troops were evidently required an important effort and a good equipment, and especially with a significant missile force that surely also the broader Christian forces did not lack at that point. So, as you understand, we don't need even to properly stereotype what these troops could be about. The artistic representations may be somewhat licentious, let's say, and therefore there is usually this image of the guy wearing a turban, having kind of lighter shields, that also in medieval historiography, the smaller shield usually was attributed to the pagan, to Muslim, etc. It was actually common of Iberian warfare altogether. But yeah, let's say that the main picture we can draw is fundamentally medium light troops, right? Conceived specifically to make mass, to provide that often overlooked amount of missile support, and still, also as infantry forces properly terrain occupational capacity and ground holding against also the large numbers, in fact, of troops that in Iberian warfare, and even more in Muslim warfare, so in the troops against which these Muslims were properly employed by their Christian masters, were plenty of, right? So yeah, it fitted pretty much well its necessities. For now, really, I don't have much else to add. We know in Mudéjar societies there were certain specialized artisans such as masons, textile workers, leather workers, silk workers. So it may be that yes, there is some kind of of idea, also Islamic influence picture we can derive from their equipment or even their material, etc. What that speaks, generally speaking, of a lighter equipment, right? But at the same time, here we see even sturdy shield, swords, possibly a helmet, right? So even here it goes. There's nothing categorical about it, and again, we don't have to recur to stereotype all the time. Also, because we have seen how varied also the conditions which these communities lived could be, right? And we will make a video specifically at some point of Muslim and Jewish troops in the Christian armies of the Reconquista. It's interesting because they're varied. There is even more. Here Christian armies employed regularly also Muslim mercenaries, sometimes even as guardsmen. This was unknown in Christian West at all, as much as there were lots of Christians also fighting, not just as subjects, but sometimes as mercenaries properly in Muslim armies, especially in the early Reconquista period. And surely we will expand on Reconquista warfare. We still have to make videos about the organizations of Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Navarre, the Nasrids, Granada, and so on. But for now, and of course the previous, the Almohads, the Almoravids, even before the Cordoban army, and so on. But for now, we stop it here. It was just a note about the Mudéjar. There's surely a fascinating feature of the Reconquista warfare. But for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.